Welcome to this edition of the Boon of Wireless podcast, coming to you as always high above the streets of northern New Jersey at ANJ Media. Yes, New Jersey, where we actually have a state dance. The square dance has been designated as the American folk dance of the state of New Jersey. Wow. Andrew, who's behind the glass as always. Today we have another first for the podcast. We have two guests joining us, so I guess it will be 3 split screens.
I guess so, John. Don't worry.
Andrew is exciting as always. All right. Our first guest is the founding member of Telecommunications Law Professionals, PLLC, or TLP as they are known. Carl Northrop consistently is recognized in client and peer reviews as one of the top communications attorneys in the country in both communications law and corporate law. Since the advent of cellular, Carl has represented diverse companies involved in all aspects of wireless, including network service providers, resellers, infrastructure suppliers, and financiers. He handles contractual matters and regulatory approvals, litigation, counseling, and strategic advice. He also advises clients in the acquisition, development, financing, licensing, construction, and operation of both wireless and terrestrial broadband systems. Jessica Gyllstrom is a member of Telecommunications Law Professionals, PLLC. Jessica's practice areas include a broad range of regulatory, policy, and transactional telecommunications and media matters. She regularly represents the mobile wireless carriers, internet service providers, VoIP providers, MVNOs, broadcasters, and tower companies before the Federal Communications Commission and other federal and state agencies. Jessica has particularly strong experience advising wireless operators on FCC compliance, licensing, and policy matters, and her transactional work largely involves the drafting and negotiation of complex submarine and terrestrial fiber optic cable system arrangements, both here in the United States and internationally. Jessica is recognized in client and peer reviews as a top communications attorney and frequently appears on industry panels to discuss spectrum and broadband-related issues and other breaking developments in communications. So please join me in welcoming Carl Northrop and Jess Gyllstrom to the broadcast. Welcome.
Well, it's good to be here.
Good to see you, Carl.
I have a preliminary question for you, though.
What's that?
I didn't know you were from New Jersey. We're in New Jersey.
I am not in New Jersey, from New Jersey. I live in northern New Jersey for the last 38 years, but I'm originally from the Philadelphia area. You can regularly see me flying my Eagles flag in the shadow of MetLife Stadium.
Well, but that's not an Eagles shirt you have on. What is that?
No, this is my college sweat. I forgot I was wearing it. It's William and Mary, College of William and Mary down in good old Williamsburg, Virginia.
Oh, so you probably went there, just like I went to Georgetown Law School, but I went there before it was hard to get in. So, I mean, when did you go to William and Mary?
Well, I was there in the late 70s, and I tell you, if you think it was hard to get in, it was even harder to get out. Let me tell you, that was a good school, top-notch education, and like Georgetown and some of the other ones. Okay, thank you. All right, so located in Washington D.C., the two of you are. Why don't we jump right into it and learn all about some of the regulatory things that are affecting everybody in the wireless ecosystem. So let's start with a little background on each of you and telecommunications law professionals. Tell us a little bit about when it was founded and what you guys do all day.
I came to Washington to go to law school back in the late 70s and wanted to become a communications attorney at the time. I had done my senior paper in undergraduate school on the cable television industry and decided that it needed to be saved. So I came to Washington to save it. By the time I got out of
how'd that work out for you?
Well, by the time I got out of law school, they had deregulated at the federal level, and I didn't want to be going down to all the different states and figuring out what to do there. So I had to change specialties, and I really started to do wireless work back then. I call myself a wireless attorney from the years BC, and BC stands for before cellular. Because I was representing paging companies when I first got out of law school, but then they all went on to become cellular companies. And so I've been doing all kinds of wireless work ever since the beginning of time. including representing resellers. And the resale business has been around a long time, but frankly, it's changed a lot over time.
Yeah, yeah. And Jess, what's your journey?
Sure. So I also was in DC for law school, and just by luck of the draw almost, I ended up in law school on the Communications Journal. Shout out to ComLaw Conspectus, which is now the Journal of Law and Technology, I believe, at Catholic Law School. And from my experience on the journal, I became just engrossed in telecommunications law and all the issues. I was particularly interested in privacy and how that was being affected by, the emergence of the internet. So at that time, there was something called Foursquare that people used to use on Facebook to check into places. So we would be at a concert at the 930 Club, and my friend would check us all in on Facebook. And so it just said, Jessica's at the 930 Club. And, and it really just started to just come up in front of all of us, being on the metro. And if somebody takes a picture of you and how that's all being affected by the changing technology, the changing laws. And so I just became very interested in that. And through that, I started pursuing internships in telecom. I was at the FCC. I worked for a provider. I did a stint at a music royalty organization. So really everything across the gauntlet, and came out of law school, and I joined TLP as the sole associate when the firm first opened, and I've been there ever since.
Good for you. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is peel back for people that want to get into the MVNO business, and resellers is what Carl referred to them as, but now they're mobile virtual network operators. And as I've spoken many times on this podcast, that everybody thinks that they can just put their name or get a Ryan Reynolds, the Mint effect, and make billions of dollars. But it's on top of everything else that you do, there's also requirements that our federal government is going to put at you as far as licensing and taxation, and also so the MVNOs have been around, or the resellers, now called MVNOs, have been around since the real early days of cellular. How has that business changed over the years from the regulatory perspective?
Well, I think it's changed both from a regulatory perspective and, frankly, from a business perspective. I mean, if you go back to the early days of cellular, all of the carriers that had networks, their primary desire was to load the networks as quickly as they could, because they had to spend a lot of money to build them and they needed to get capacity. And they couldn't do it all themselves. They didn't have the huge organizations that they have now. They didn't have all the retail shops that they have now. So they just needed to have ways to kind of get units in service. And so they basically went out and hired agents, and resellers, and, asked them to do it. At the time, early on, most of those early resellers ended up getting bought by the underlying carrier, because it was really in kind of an interim arrangement. And so many of the early resellers just, weren't around after a while because they were bought out by the underlying carrier. The evolution over time has become, the resale business has really become much more of a standalone business. And so you take the underlying carriers, they are actively cultivating resellers, but it's for a different reason. It's not because their networks are empty. It's because it's all about who has the most net adds, right? So AT&T and T-Mobile, Verizon, they're just all talking about how many units they added last month. And, the best way for them to do that is to have people out there actively selling. And so, they're hiring people, but, as they're hiring them to do the resale work, they're also putting requirements on them. We'd like you to put a certain number of units on every year for the next 5 years. And that way it kind of really helps them build their business.
Yeah. So that's verbatim out of contracts that I've seen from the carriers. This is your wholesale purchase commitment, and this is the length of the contract. And if you don't hit it, we're not going to get rid of you. We're just going to send you a bill.
Right.
Yeah.
You're going to pay for it when you use it or lose it. Right.
Right. So it's a very unique dynamic where in the relationship between the carrier, the Verizons, et cetera, and the MVNO, that the MVNO is both a competitor and a customer. Have you ever seen any issues with that? I mean, for as long as I've been around, I think they've been managing it well. There's been some skirmishes, but have you ever seen any real issues with that dynamic coming into play?
Well, I'll tell you one of the issues that I discuss a lot with both the reseller and then also with the carriers is, when you're building a customer base on someone else's network, and when the end user has got the right to port their number away from you to somebody else, you just have to worry about, your continuing ability to control the customer. And so knowing that the underlying carrier has got access to all of the telephone numbers, having provisions in the agreement that provide some protection against them if you decided to move, coming in and trying to raid your customers, is just something that's worth trying to do, because you don't want to have them, keep the customer if you decide for one reason or another you're going to go to another carrier.
Right, right. And I know that we've discussed over the last couple of months on some clients that I'm working with, and this will lead us into our next area on who actually owns that customer. So if I'm a small startup MVNO and don't have the resources to do a lot of things, I'll go to one of them, to a current MVNO or to a carrier that has an MVNO out of a box, so to speak, right? So they do everything for you, and the MVNO will do what's in their best, capacity. They'll do sales and marketing to bring customers in, and they don't want to worry about provisioning a phone, activating, customer service. They just want to make money with their brand. So why don't you give our listeners a short roadmap on what is needed to check all those required boxes, and then I want to revisit the who owns the customer discussion. Okay, so I want to be an MVNO. What do I have to do from a legal and regulatory basis? Forget about all the service side. All right.
So as you mentioned, there's different types of MVNOs, right? Some of them act simply as branded resellers and they don't own infrastructure, and then some have infrastructure and they'll administer their own resources and customer service and things like that, just as you were mentioning. So the model that's chosen really is going to affect the extent of the regulatory obligations, as well as the terms of the actual agreement that the MVNO has with the MNO. So that could dictate responsibility for certain regulatory requirements as well. But that being said, I think it makes sense to start with two of the initial requirements that an MVNO is going to want to handle before it starts to offer service. And that's the International Section 214 authorization and the FCC Form 499 filer ID.
Can you break them down? I know the 214 is for offering international LD. Then let's jump into the 499.
Sure. The first thing you're going to want to do, though, is you're going to want to register with the FCC for what's called an FRN, and that's the registration number. Essentially, every company doing business with the FCC is required to have one. It's free. It's easy to acquire. You just sign up through the FCC system, and bam, you get a number, and that is your identification number for the FCC. Going down to the International 214 that you mentioned, you're correct in that it allows an MVNO to provide telecommunications service between the U.S. and abroad. Securing that authorization is going to require filing an application with the FCC that primarily consists of a number of certifications as well as ownership disclosures. Without getting on too much of a tangent, I will note that if the applicant has any direct or indirect foreign ownership of 10% or greater, then the application could be referred to a separate group of agencies informally known as Team Telecom, and it will undergo an additional review. Like I mentioned, this is separate.
Yeah, let me stop you there. There are entities out there that provide international long distance, and very recently said your client does not have to get their 214, they can use ours, and we'll handle the tax collection, tax remittance, the connectivity, et cetera, et cetera. Is that something that is out there?
The answer to that is yes, but if they're doing that, then the rates that are being charged and collected and charged have to be that other party's rates and not the rates. So you really aren't marking up or charging and making your own money on the international service if you do that.
Well,
So
it's
you
a
get
convenience. It's a convenience, if
right.
you're happy making the margin on your, you're buying the service from the carrier and reselling it, and you're happy with those margins. Yeah, it's a pass through. Okay.
Right.
Okay. All
Well,
right.
and the other thing I will say, and I have this conversation with clients and prospective clients all the time, there are clearly benefits in working through somebody who does that work for you.
Yep.
But
Yep.
it's also a middleman. In other words,
Yes.
probably the way to have the greatest margins is for you to be dealing directly with the carrier and doing as much of that yourself and not kind of working through a third party, because just more people are dividing up the pie. But the benefits come in some of the regulatory obligations that you save yourself having to do, and it can also be a question of timing, because particularly if there's any foreign ownership, it can take you a long time to get a 214.
Okay. So other than the 214 and the 499 and the registration you talked about, are there any other quote unquote boxes that need to be checked until you start getting into the commercial side of the business?
There may be some regulatory requirements that you're going to want to keep in mind and perhaps submit prior to launching, and that could include, a certification regarding robocall mitigation efforts. That could include CALIA plan, and that's the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act. But a lot of these may be covered under your agreement with the underlying provider, especially if you don't have control over the network. So responsibility for these compliance areas really need to be reviewed in the agreement before you start, pulling your hair out trying to figure it all out.
Okay. Other than the FCC, are there any other agencies that need to be involved?
Well, Team Telecom may be involved, as I mentioned, and that consists of, the Departments of Justice, Defense, Homeland Security, and various other federal agencies and offices.
But that would
there
that
also
depend on
may be, there may be state and local tax issues that need to be
Right.
addressed.
Yep.
Now, frankly, that's not something we do a lot of as Federal Regulatory Counsel, but many of our clients have agreements with support groups that end up handling those sorts of filings for them, so that they can kind of stay in compliance with their state and local tax obligations.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
often 911 taxes, things
Right.
like that
Right.
at the state level.
If everything goes well, and being in this business for a long time, it never does. But if everything goes well, what's the time frame to get those two licenses? Typically, if there's no foreign ownership involved.
If there's no foreign ownership and you're filing a 214, it really depends on the FCC's backlog. But if it's simple and it's streamlined, it could be, let's say, 1 to 3 months, maybe. Not too long. If there is foreign ownership, then you're looking at 8 to 10 months, maybe. And that really depends on the level of interest at Team Telecom, along with the responsiveness of the applicant itself.
Okay. With regards to a potential MVNO going direct to the carrier, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, if I'm an MVNO and I have the ability to meet that 5-year contract with the multi-million-dollar commitment, versus going to one of their aggregators. And for our listeners and viewers, an aggregator is just that. A lot of people want to be an MVNO and they have a good differentiator and a good solid distribution plan, but they just don't check the carrier's box on doing X amount of $1 million of purchasing of wholesale. And so they go through an aggregator. Are there different sets of rules or licenses if you go direct to a carrier or if you go to an aggregator? Or they're pretty similar?
I think we kind of touched upon this earlier in that, full MVNO, you're going to need to get that 214, which adds to your timing and cost and all that. And it really is going to depend on the nature of the aggregator agreement. So, for instance, like we discussed, if the MVNO is essentially just that marketing agent, and as Carl mentioned, doesn't mark up prices and is really just marketing those telecom services, it's not considered a telecom provider and may not be subject to a lot of these requirements.
So I've got my money in the bank. I've got my licenses. What are some of the stumbling blocks that I know, but the new entrant may not know. So what are some of the road bumps, stumbling blocks that someone who wants to enter the business as an MVNO might encounter?
Well, and I will say, and this is, kind of following up what we said before, there's a lot of people that don't understand how long the 214 process can take. And we've actually had more people come to us with foreign ownership than, you might expect necessarily, but, they're kind of involved in this business. They get to know people that are doing it, overseas. They kind of want to do it together. And before you know it, you've got an applicant that has got, diverse ownership, including foreign ownership, and they just don't have an idea, how long that process is going to take. So, I think that's really the main thing. The contracts themselves, and this, I know, John, because you help people with this kind of stuff. There can be a lot of different contracts involved in getting everything set up in order to do it. And people do different amounts of work themselves. I mean, some people are, in fact, kind of purchasing units and putting units out there and kind of managing their own inventory and the like. Some people are kind of managing their own numbers. So they have to kind of be familiar with the kind of the numbering process and, how the numbers get assigned and, how they can get in the queue for numbers. Then there's the whole question of number portability. I mean, you've got a client and they've got it, and then who's actually going to be the one that's porting the number? In some cases, it's the MVNO, and they want to maintain access to that number, and therefore they end up being the one that has to handle porting. And there are very specific rules and requirements in order to meet porting obligations. There are timeframes you have to respond by and other things. So it really all depends on what the business model is and how much of that stuff they take on and how much of it they're going to be responsible for.
Right. And then, of course, if the customer who wants to port owes money on that device, it stops everything.
Right. That's exactly right.
You just can't say, oh, I was paying $25 a month for 6 months and it was supposed to be 36 months and I decided to leave. Oh, well, you're not taking this phone
right.
with you.
That's exactly right.
Go buy a new one. Okay. From your experience and from a regulatory perspective, are there any surprises that the MVNO encounters that they weren't expecting? Like, what do you mean I have to do this? I have to. So Jess is shaking her head. She must have some good examples.
I think that a lot of MVNOs may be surprised to find themselves subject to the FCC altogether, and especially subject to changing FCC rules and regulations, and needing to really pay attention to what's going on at the FCC. So, for example, broadband labeling was a big one that just went into effect and requires the posting of essentially a food nutrition label that outlines the broadband offerings. And of course, like most things at the FCC, there are a lot of nuances with this. So you really need to be vigilant and you need to be paying attention to what's happening at the FCC in order to kind of stay abreast of everything.
So a sharp MVNO operator, should they have someone with regulatory experience on their staff, whether it's their CFO or something, or
I was going to say they should hire a regulatory attorney.
Well, that's
or two.
TLP.law. No, that certainly helps, but it is one of those things that there are a lot of folks out there willing to help these startups, firms, and attorneys and consultants. Right. So
okay.
I have one additional thing I would add as an answer to your question, John. Some of the people that come to us that want help with an MVNO agreement don't have any idea what the carriers are going to require in terms of deposits, in terms of minimum unit commitments, and in terms of credit checks and the like. And it can be a sobering experience. So I mean, we have people who have come thinking that they're going to be a direct MVNO with one of the major carriers and end up kind of going with an aggregator because they aren't prepared to make those commitments, to start out with.
It's interesting too because I had a client that I put in front of one of the three carriers, and I thought we were going to get the deal done, but there were some nuances in that agreement that they just couldn't agree to, and ended up going with an aggregator of that same carrier. And the pricing was actually lower. And I said, how does this happen? He says, well, we have so much volume. We're going to exceed our commitment that we made to the carrier, not only this year, but next year and next year as well, based on our growth. And we can, for the right deal, we can cut the margin a little bit that we get. I said, well, God bless you. So, yeah, and it's interesting. And where there's a high startup with a carrier, it's lower startup with the aggregator because they're getting it from many, many people.
Right.
And and look, you've read these contracts with the carriers. It's a tough nut. That commitment is a very big number.
Well, and the other thing that we've found is as more and more of the carriers are doing more and more resale agreements,
Mm-hmm.
they're becoming less and less flexible about making changes.
Yes.
So, they've got a handful of people that they've got deals with, and if any one of them finds out that this guy got this deal and I didn't, then there's going to be
Mm-hmm.
now they don't have most favorization clauses in them, but I mean, people talk. And so they find out what's going to go on. So as a consequence, it does get hard sometimes to negotiate deals. There are provisions in agreements that I used to be able to negotiate that you just can't do anymore because they just don't have the same amount of flexibility, and the people you're dealing with don't have as much authority to make changes.
Well, back at the old alma mater, my favorite class was business law. And 8 o'clock, and never missed one, but that was tough. But I hope I don't say this wrong. Companies that are similarly situated, that was the thing, have to have the same terms and conditions.
Right.
And then the variable would be volume. Right? Everything is volume. And it's funny because whenever someone calls and says, hey, we want to explore getting into the MVNO business, can you help us? I said, yeah, but I'll ask you the question, because as soon as I put you in front of a carrier or an aggregator, they're going to ask you the 3 simple words: what's your forecast? And that's all they care about. What is your forecast? Not all they care about. Obviously, you want to have they're not going to bring on too many Me Too's. They want to have a diverse group of MVNOs reporting under them. So, but yeah, what's your forecast? That way they can gauge whether they're going to spend time with you or not. So anyway, with the explosion, and I use that word, not loosely, but the explosion of the MVNOs that are coming on board now, not just here, but all over the country, all over the world. A lot of them now in IoT. What changes, if any, do you see on the regulatory horizon that are going to come into the MVNO space?
Well, one of the things I would say, and you and I have had this discussion, I think, on occasion, John, I think it's more and more important for an MVNO to have something that sets them apart from both the underlying carrier, but also, the other MVNOs, if they want to have success. Because, there's a lot of people, a lot of places you can go to get wireless service, and so why are they going to come to you rather than going to somebody else? And so
that's the second question I ask prospective MVNOs, and excuse me for interrupting, but hey, I'm in New Jersey. That's what we do here.
That's what we do in New York.
All right, okay, all right. Just a small river separating us. I always say, what is your differentiator? And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, why am I going to leave Verizon or Consumer Cellular or Ultra or Simple or T-Mobile to come with you? What's in it for me to come? And a lot of them don't know.
Well, and there's an initial assumption that they're going to be cheaper, but I mean, not everybody. I mean, you don't want to have everybody competing on price, because if everybody's competing on price, it's going to become a zero-sum game.
Correct.
So, as a practical matter, you'd like to find some other way to distinguish yourself. And frankly, we've seen some people with some very creative ideas.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. And so that's the first question. The second question is, what is your distribution? How are you going to go to market? Are you going to be 100% digital? Are you going to have brick and mortar? Are you going to have a direct sales team out there? You're going to take an airplane out with an 800 number and fly it over the beach in the summer. Call us for cheap cellular. But yeah, so it's a lot of people that I speak with don't really know what they think they're getting into.
Well, and if you had people, I mean, I haven't had anybody for a long time that was going to open a brick and mortar business.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it just seems to me that,
Yeah.
there's a lot of those out there. And,
Yep. Well, they normally say I'm going to be the cheapest priced and I'm going to have the best customer service. And as I said before, we turn a lot down because it's not going to work when you're competing against people Mint, and now Mint's going to be part of T-Mobile, as we know. And the other thing is, other than being the best price, I wish them best of luck at that time and say, let us know how it worked out. Then they say we're going to open up stores in the urban areas. I said, all right, I'll let Boost know that you're coming, and some of the other carriers that operate in the urban areas around the country. But yeah, it's crazy. They have this money and they want to get into the wireless business, but I don't really think they know what they're getting into, and that's why we have to kind of walk them through
right.
and enlist regulatory people and all that kind of stuff as well.
It's
yeah.
real quick, just a fun side note. It's been interesting to see the celebrity factor associated with MVNOs. Like obviously Ryan Reynolds, right, and Mint Mobile, but you're seeing Ted Danson, I think, come out with Choice. He's the spokesman. There's a lot of athletes associated with it. I keep joking, and you heard it here first. This is going to be the new tequila for celebrities, right?
Yes,
Everyone's going to want a piece of the MVNO.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
you heard it here first.
Well, it's
wait till a
because,
Kardashian comes out.
Yeah, right. Well, there's other celebrities that should put their name on a product, and they could sit back and count more money. Yep. But it's interesting. A friend of mine, I'll give him a plug here. Josh Gordon, CEO of Red Pocket Mobile. One of his brands now, Julius Irving, Dr. J, is their spokesperson. I'm like, I actually chatted with him yesterday, texted and I said, what is with Dr. J? And he goes, it's great, isn't it? I said, okay. But you've got Ted Danson at Consumer, and you've got other people coming out. And and I think the next step to go into the entertainment and this and that is the influencer. They're going to put their names on. And actually, we've had conversations with some people who can bring us, I can bring you this person. I'm not going to say it is, internationally known, billions of followers or whatever the number is. And I said, okay, if you bring them, we'll brand it, right, and we'll get you up and running. It hasn't happened yet, but you think about some of the people that are on the, the top 5, top 10 list of whatever their Q ratio is. That how you say it? I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, that would put on 1 million subscribers in a month.
Should make sure to protect against TikTok going away and make sure those influencer standards stay up. So
yeah, we'll see. Some people think it's good for competition. Some people think it's bad for competition when someone like T-Mobile buys Ultra and Mint. Forget about the aggregator. When Verizon purchased TracFone and their 20 million customers. My first guest, Peter Adderton of founded Boost Mobile, still runs it in Australia and also just launched Mobile X. Very vocal about the carriers killing off the MVNO business. And then my next guest, who runs T-Mobile's wholesale group, said, I've never been more confident about the robust growth that we're all going to see in the MVNO business based on everybody's. So it's kind of a balancing act, I guess, on should the carriers be permitted to buy the MVNOs? If we don't buy them, someone else will. But do you guys have any view on that of the very large, successful MVNOs being eaten up from a competitive standpoint or from a regulatory standpoint?
Well, Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the FCC decided quite some time ago that they didn't consider MVNOs to be, kind of basically market competitors, right?
To the carrier.
Even though they could be influencing, for example, pricing.
Yeah. Right. So when they're doing their competitive analyses, when there are buyouts, right. A lot of people have come in and say, well, the market's actually bigger. It's not just, it's not just T-Mobile and Verizon and AT&T. You have all these other people, and basically they say, look, if they're not facility based,
right.
then they aren't going to be taken into consideration in the competitive analysis. Interestingly, at various points in my career, I've been hired by people to take substantive positions, either for or against major acquisitions of wireless companies. And the argument is always the same: is that as the number of carriers goes down, that the service is going to become less and less competitive, and prices are going to keep going up.
Right.
I don't think it's happened as much as everyone thought it was going to happen.
Yeah, I agree.
It's just, it seems to me that I think if we got down where we didn't have at least three major competitors, it might be bad. But when T-Mobile was taking out Sprint, there was a lot of people that said, look, going from 4 to 3 is a terrible thing. That's going to be, they're going to be better off to cooperate with each other than to compete.
Right.
But I will say they seem to be competing pretty mightily.
Well, if Dish ever, starts building out a true national network, we'll see what happens there. I can't say anything negative about that. But yeah, I survived I didn't survive actually. When Sprint bought Nextel back in the early 2000s, I was on the Nextel side down in your neck of the woods, Reston. And then I also didn't survive when T-Mobile bought Sprint.
Right.
So I've been through this a few times. So it's never good to be on the it's good to be the acquirer.
Yeah, I agree.
Not the acquiree. Yeah. So anyway.
Well, and for many years, one of my largest clients was Metro PCS.
Oh, sure.
Which its claim to fame for many years is it was the fifth largest wireless carrier.
Right.
And then when it got bought out by T-Mobile, T-Mobile had kind of a law firm of its own inside.
Yeah. Well, they are now, and then we can wrap up. They are now the largest prepaid MVNO.
Right.
So with some of the acquisitions don't work out. I think that Dish obviously is struggling with Boost, and they've had not a mass exodus, but some very key people have left in the last 6 months. That organization that were handling their wireless side, and TracFone has lost a lot of customers since Verizon, and so sometimes these things don't work. But Verizon automatically became the largest prepaid carrier,
right?
With acquiring 20 million customers. It's funny.
Well, and I always thought that the Sprint Nextel deal was really one of the kind of least well orchestrated mergers ever.
That's a subject of another conversation, and I will not argue with that because I was there firsthand.
Right.
Anything else that our listeners and viewers may need to know about the regulatory landscape and how it may be changing with so many new MVNOs coming in, not just on the wireless side but on the IoT machine to machine? Are you bracing for additional sets of standards or anything like that?
I will say it's always evolving and changing, and we're also in an election year that can also have an impact whether or not it's the current administration trying to get things passed before the election or the current administration continuing. So I would say stay vigilant. Okay,
well, good. Well, that's great. I appreciate both of you taking time out of your day. I know this is not billable hours for what you're doing with me today, so I want to thank you.
Oh, wait, I have to tear up this bill? Oh my goodness!
Just send it to Andrew. He'll take care of it. All right, so I am going to be an MVNO. I want to be an MVNO. How do I contact your firm if I decide to use your firm?
Well, www.tlp.law.
Okay.
That's our website, and kind of you go in there. We've got 8 attorneys here, but if you want to do an MVNO work, Jess and I are probably the ones to do most of it. So
good.
We're the ones to call.
Well, good. For what I've seen from your work with some of the clients I'm dealing with, an MVNO would not hurt themselves by going with you. You guys,
well, I appreciate
do
it.
a terrific job. Okay. Well, listen, I want to. Anything else in closing about anything on the landscape or anything you want to talk about?
Well, no, I think you've done a good job. I will say one thing that I was thinking should be mentioned in the course of this. Okay. It may be an aside, but it does seem to me that you know, the Comcast deal really was, I think, the beginning of kind of people really building significant businesses as MVNOs,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
they've done it for a long time. They've done it, doing it on the Verizon network. But I think that really was kind of a sea change in terms of it becoming a business, which wasn't just a transitional business. It wasn't I'm going to build a customer base and then hope I can sell it. I mean, it was really establishing an independent business, kind of in this space. And I think that's inspired some people.
Yeah, well, you're talking Comcast, you're talking Charter Communications with
Right.
Spectrum. Cox just got into it,
Yeah.
and I know the Cable Association is working with a couple aggregators to, with their 800 members, if you can get 100 new MVNOs out of the 800.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a lot. But again, the question still is: are you using wireless to your broadband customer to generate more revenue, or to keep them as your broadband customer? The old triple play has now become the quadruple play.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. Exactly right.
And the interesting thing about them, and I'll be writing an article in about 2 weeks about the Q1 2024 results, that the carriers, and now I include cable. I believe Comcast had more net adds than Verizon in the first quarter, so I'll double check that. But and they've only penetrated 15 to 20% of their entire customer base. So there's so much opportunity for these people to continue to grow that business. So good. So let me wrap up by saying thank you again for coming on today, Jessica Gyllstrom and Carl Northrup from TLP down in Washington, D.C. I want to I appreciate you taking the time out of your day and joining us here on the podcast. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon. So thank you very much both for coming on today.
Thanks for having us, John. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. That'll wrap up another episode of the Boon of Wireless podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks.